Hello, hello, and welcome to Othello. Hello, hello, welcome everyone to Othello. This is My Ed Space and Eleanor Does English. We are joining for our lesson 11 on Shakespeare's Othello, our Key Stage 5 My Ed Space free stream course for A-level English literature. And today we are going to be looking at the theme of love and marriage in Shakespeare's Othello. Okay, so this stream, as well as all of my content for A-level, is completely free and accessible for everyone. This is regardless of exam board or specification that you have. If you are learning Othello, these lessons will help your knowledge by broadening, strengthening, advancing, pushing your ideas, presenting you with new ones hopefully as well, allowing you to do some revision and enabling you to know this text and feel confident in this text going forward. In the chat, do we have anyone who is here for the first time? Welcome, if so. The chat is enabled, so feel free to put any questions, any ideas that you have in it so that I can respond to it, so that I can clarify as well any misconceptions you have. And then we'll get into it. So, for AQA A-level English literature, the paper in which you have your Othello question is a paper about love through the ages. So invariably, the question you'll have for the Othello question will have something to do with some kind of relationship, some kind of love between characters, perhaps the marriage, perhaps a specific character who is presented and how they love or what love looks like to them. This can also be the flip side of ideas about love and marriage. For example, ideas about the breaking down of a marriage, of the fated nature perhaps of Desdemona and Othello's marriage, the kind of fundamentally crucial marriage to this play. But for someone perhaps studying Edexcel, this might seem like a quite unusual theme to have, because when you think of Othello, you possibly think more of ideas like jealousy or race or perhaps gender or power. We don't really think of the flip side of those, that's love, or the element of those themes that's love. But really, if we think about jealousy or power, where does that jealousy come from? It stems perhaps from an imperfect love, or from too much love, or from loving one person in a way that's inappropriate, for example, in an idealized way that puts Desdemona on a pedestal, or perhaps loving someone they oughtn't to, like Iago, putting their trust and their love in someone they shouldn't, and facing the consequences for it. So, let's get started. For anyone who's new, this is me. I'm Eleanor. I'm one of the teachers at My Ed Space. I've been teaching A-level for a long time now, and we'll be doing all of the free stream content for A-level at this time. So, some review for people just joining us. Feel free to put your answers in the chat as well. It doesn't have to be full sentences. It can just be your ideas kind of poured into the chat so that we can check them. If you're not sure what, for example, Hamartia is, feel free to put that in the chat as well. I'm happy to go over it. Your questions here are: what could be considered Othello's Hamartia? How does Iago make Othello jealous? How is Othello affected by jealousy? Who else is affected by jealousy in the play? And what is the proof Iago provides of Desdemona's infidelity? So I can see that some people perhaps are typing in the chat. That's great. In the meantime, let's take a look. Okay, so Hamartia is a character's fatal flaw. Here. So we could, and traditionally it's considered his fatal flaw is jealousy, but we can also absolutely consider it to be his trust, right? Putting his trust in the wrong person. His idealization, perhaps, of Desdemona. Or perhaps we can view it as his lack of love for Desdemona, right? The fact that he's so willing to believe that she is unfaithful. We've also talked about insecurities and perhaps this idea of self-love, right? The fact that Othello is seemingly really insecure and internalizes all the racism and prejudice of the Venetians, perhaps thinking about this in a different idea. We've also talked about the fact that this is part of what breaks down with Othello's self-destruction. Perhaps it's also his naivete, right? His inability to see what's in front of him. The fact that he perhaps loves Iago more than Desdemona, and that this is part of his issue. How does Iago make Othello jealous? By insinuating that his wife has cuckolded him, and that his love is misplaced. So interestingly, there when we looked at our lesson on Othello and jealousy, and we answered these questions very differently, right? But thinking and framing our thinking through love and marriage instead, we can think about how we can shift these ideas that are very common to analyze in this play as motivated by love, as using love as the manipulating technique. And how is Othello affected by this jealousy and this love? Well, for example, he loses what he loves. So he loses his relationship and his marriage. He also, if we're thinking about different kinds of love, loses his friends. He loses Cassio. He loses his reputation. He loses his future. He loses his wife. He loses his sanity. He loses his life, right? So again, we're thinking about this kind of flip side of ideas like jealousy, really as being this idea of love embedded within it and really working with it. How is he also affected by jealousy? He destroys what he loves, right? He replaces it, as he himself says, with hate. Who else is affected by jealousy and love and relationships in this play? Well, we have Iago and Emilia, right? Loses his face, no, his life. Didn't say face, I don't think. Did I, M11? I hope not. Maybe his place, I said. Iago and Emilia. Hello, hello. Scott, Iago manipulates Othello and puts the ideas of an affair in his head to make him jealous. Yeah, so this idea of Iago knowing Othello and knowing what he cares about, and thus knowing that Othello is this loving, open, easy manner that he can be pulled and led tenderly as an ass can, that it's his fear of loss of love, it is this mislove that will link here. Vijay, welcome as well. Great Vijay, feel free to still follow along. Let me know if anything is unclear. If you're looking to improve your English, listening to it definitely will help. Perhaps if you turn the subtitles on, just in case it's confusing for you, so you can read along as well, let me know. Oh, I see what you mean. Okay, M11, I thought I misspoke. His personality, his reputation, all his good qualities. Yes, he loses face. I see what you mean. Absolutely. This love marriage relationship, we also have Cassio and Bianca. We have the fraternal bonds between men. We have the sororal bonds between women here. So the brotherly and sisterly relationships we have here. We have Desdemona as someone who has been described as the most loving, right? Not jealousy as such, but she is a victim of this, right? Because she loves purely or perhaps transgressively, right? This idea of love being transgressive here as well links love then to violence and punishment and societal rejection. I'm glad, Advika, that this will be helpful. And then proof of this love, of this favour, we have again fixated here on the handkerchief. On the handkerchief, right? As proof not just handkerchief, not just of love, because it's described as a love token, but also of the betrayal of that love. Right? The ocular proof. Desdemona's father as well, M11, 100%. Yeah, because it's his loss of love that he finds part of his destruction, right? His grief at the loss. Is that also motivated by prejudice? Absolutely. Can we manipulate that into thinking about it as a loss of love? Absolutely, right? We've got to work smarter, not harder here. We also, with this idea of love and purity, we have throughout the play a lot of religious imagery. Why is this? Because love and devotion are linked here. There's this idea of devotion or spiritual love that comes through in the early scenes with Desdemona and Othello, and also in Cassio's language. This idea of Desdemona and Rodrigo as well, to a certain extent. So I suppose we could put him up here as well, though love is always questionable with Rodrigo. He's such a fool and a clown that we can't really take him as seriously. But this idea of spiritual love, of a woman being this kind of paragon of virtue that you pray to, and who withstands love and any possible threat to this love and continues loving passively and continuously. But also within that, that's problematic, right? Because if we're thinking about devotion and spiritual love to a person, then that is something that's unsustainable. That's not looking at that person as human. That's thinking them perhaps as one-dimensional. And then we get into ideas like the Madonna whore dichotomy. In which we don't really see women in particular as full women that are complex, but rather as one of these two ideas, only one of which is deserving of love. M11. You speculated he betrayed his father, so would do the same to Othello. Or was that just Othello's thought? Interesting, good memory. So Brabantio says this to Othello. Iago reminds him of it, and Othello says it as well himself. So you're absolutely right. This idea of mistrust with love. and control within love as well. Absolutely works. Okay, so let's brainstorm it out, right? Different kinds of love here. What kind of lines of argument? Because, for example, if you get this question on the exam, depending on your exam board, you may have an extract, you may not. But we would want to think immediately, okay, how can we address this to build these different arguments, right? So, for example, we think immediately, right, of Othello and Desdemona. We think of the loss of love. We think of this idea of betrayal with love. We think of this trajectory, this idea that love is doomed or fated. This idea of transgressive love. This idea of, with actually transgressive love, adulterous, of lust, over love as well. This idea of cuckoldry, what does that bring us to? Ideas of reputation. Could we argue that Othello doesn't really care as much about Desdemona as he does about his reputation? Absolutely. This idea of love to power. M11, 100%. Power dynamics within love, right? Which leads us to ideas of sacrifice then, right? Love and violence being brought together. Love as this idea of trust. And between different characters. Othello and Desdemona is obvious, but what about Othello and Iago? For example, in Act 3, Scene 3, we have Othello and Iago kneeling to each other and promising a bond to each other, that they will serve each other for life. What does that sound like? A marriage, right? He trusts Iago clearly more than Desdemona, so does he love Desdemona more or less than Iago? We also have to think about someone like Cassio, right? And that brings us to quite a lot of ideas, right? Cassio and Desdemona and their supposed affair. But also this view of him thinking of her as something to worship, divine Desdemona, who he looks at, versus Cassio and Bianca, how he treats Bianca. Definitely can bring in the Madonna whore dichotomy there, right? We can also think of his love with Othello. With both of this dynamic and this dynamic, can we think of some kind of latent love between them on a sexual level or a romantic level? And can we use a lens like queer theory to say, well, there is an element here of them desiring each other more so than the heterosexual couples here. We have parent-child or paternal love here, right? Going back to Brabantio, does he love Desdemona, or as we've seen in a previous lesson, does he view her transactionally as a way to gain more power and status for himself? Men's friendship, M11, 100%. So this idea of men's friendship being based on equality, right? They're considered bonded together. They're considered equals, whereas marital love is controlled by the man. And Desdemona saying, "Will you come to bed, my lord," for example, is extremely transgressive. Him inviting her into his bed, into her bed, their bed, subverts that power dynamic that speaks to love as having something to do with the relationships between them. Thoughts? I can see your question. An all-time favorite philosophy book. If you're looking for philosophy books, Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse is great. All-time, my favorite book is Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which isn't philosophy. It's from the Romantic era, but we'll leave it for now. Then let's think of marriage. Okay, right? So if your question is specifically on marriage, what can we do here? We can think of marriage, for example, this marriage in particular, as transgressive and focus on that for a whole paragraph. We can focus on this idea of it being fated. We can focus on this idea of it being transactional. We can speak about the power dynamics within marriage, perhaps as one-sided, and maybe we can counter-argument thinking about Emilia's perspective on marriage and her role as much more equal to her husband. Love versus duty in marriage, maybe, Lucy? I love that. 100%. This idea of sex within marriage, right? Of sex and virginity within marriage, and perhaps its links to ownership, right? And we also need to think about, with the Jacobean audience, this idea of miscegenation, which is particularly the interracial marriages between black and white people, particularly thinking about the progeny created from that, so the children created from those interracial marriages. At the time, that would have been extremely transgressive and taboo. Lucy as well, ideas of jealousy. Absolutely, jealousy within marriage. Men's dominance in marriage, of course. And then if we think of that, we can think of, in a different paragraph, women's passivity or women's victimhood within marriage. Marriage as linked to violence. Absolutely. There's so much we can talk about, right? We can focus on, for example, Iago and Emilia's marriage. And what Emilia says is the role of a wife, but also the fact that he kills her in the end. Endings of marriage would be crucial as well here, right? All right, so let's take a look at some ideas here. So these are some critics, quite a few critics, who talk about love and marriage in the play. Okay, and this kind of will help us to frame our ideas within our different arguments that we'll be looking at today. So Honigmann says, one wonders whether men are capable of unselfish love. Interesting here immediately, right? If we think about this idea of love not as, the perfect thing, but rather as something selfish, controlling, dominant, as Emma Levin said, or jealous, as Lucy said. Hollingdale says, Othello simply cannot believe his own improbable love story that defies Venetian social and cultural codes. So this idea of it being improbable, perhaps doomed, because it is transgressive, and the fact that he can't believe it. So he thinks there's no way this will work, right? And thus perhaps is more vulnerable to suggestions of jealousy. As Levis says, who we've seen before, Othello slips readily into possessive jealousy because he's self-centered. Othello's jealousy is unassociated with any real interest in Desdemona as a person. So think about that. That's such a nice way to talk about the fact that love or marriage is actually more complicated than just, oh, Othello loves Desdemona, Desdemona loves Othello, Iago's evil and ruins it, right? There's this idea of, is Othello using Desdemona in a similar way that Brabantio is? Halstead says that Othello is sexually naive, and his relationship with Desdemona fails because it is based on idolatrous love. So the idea that he thinks of her as this pinnacle and paragon of the elite, of purity, of goodness, of power, such as it is, a woman, and essentially worships her. So when he begins to doubt that she is perfect, everything comes crashing down, which shows how little it was based on at the beginning. Lepede says that woman is an excellent ornament of men. So this idea of women in a secondary role here, their role as decorative. So for example, this would serve with Cassio, where he talks about Desdemona as divine Desdemona, this beautiful woman, focuses on this beauty. And then with Bianca, he calls her a bauble, so literally a decoration, right? This thing that's hanging around on him and is purely decorative. So in both, really not seeing them as a complex person. Bradley, talking about Desdemona, is her nature is infinitely sweet and her love is absolute. Such a good way to talk about Desdemona's relationship here, her view of Othello, which we looked at, for example, when we looked at race, and how Desdemona describes Othello's race is different radically from the other Venetians. Tenenhouse says Jacobean tragedies offer up their scenes of excessive punishment, as if mutilating the female could somehow correct political corruption. So this idea of women then as sacrificed within marriages in order to recover social or political power. It's interesting. So it comes from his insecurity, sees her as someone better than him. Yeah, exactly. 11 is one way you could look at it. You could also absolutely argue that Othello deeply loves Desdemona. Many critics have done both. Right? Jardine says that Desdemona is glorious in her resignation in the face of husbandly chastisement. So she kind of, though she's being accused of adultery, though she's being called a whore and a strumpet and a bawd and all these ideas, though she's spurned by her husband, though she's murdered by her husband, the whole time she's resigned to the fact that she deserves that, and as a matter of fact says it's meet, like it's fair that he should chastise me. I'm just a babe to it. So she essentially says, I'm not used to being chastised, so that's why I'm upset by it, but I deserve it, clearly. And thinking about women then as self-sacrificial as well. French says Desdemona is self-denying in the extremes. This idea that she kind of prioritizes her husband, as she says in Act 1, above her husband, above herself, gives into all of this. And in that, particularly Act 5, Scene 2, when she says, commend me to my kind lord, with her final breath, this idea of her trying to save him and pardon him despite her treatment by him. These issues, how related to today's society, depends on culture as well. Maybe we can find some similarities now. Yeah, definitely. I mean, if we're thinking about the presence of patriarchy in both, and the fact that patriarchy informs the way men and women and all genders are socialized to treat each other in traditional relationships like marriage, absolutely. Dolan describes Othello's love as tyrannical, so like a tyrant. That makes sense for talking about power and love, or as M11 said, dominance, for example, or love to power, absolutely. Men's role within marriage. Cavell says that we need not ask. We need to ask not so much how Iago gained his power as how Desdemona lost hers. So this idea of why was she so easily able to lose the power and fixation that Othello had for her. Marchitello says marriage in which power relations could be negotiated and challenged as well as adopted and accepted. So this idea of marriage and power being linked then, and thinking of marriage, particularly indoors in the domestic sphere, as a place in which men and women were a little bit more equal than outside in society, right? Clearly, there were two different spheres of influence. The external world, in which men were obviously in charge, and then the domestic sphere, in which women were the moral center, right? That requires a lot of expectation on them, because that means that they are expected to be the most moral person, even if their husband is not. But also speaks to this idea that this was their space in which they had some modicum of control. So let's look at some ideas about love and marriage, shall we? Let's look at how Othello describes their love story here. We don't get as much of a description as to Desdemona's version, except for in Act 1. So let's take a look first at Othello's, because really he's given much more time to speak in the court scene. He says, anything that stands out to you, analysis-wise, interpretation-wise, you just want explained, feel free to put it in the chat. Her father loved me, oft invited me, still questioned me the story of my life from year to year, the battles, sieges, fortunes that I have passed. I ran it through, even from my boyish days, to the very moment that he bade me tell it, wherein I spoke of most disastrous chances, of moving accidents by flood and field, of hairbreadth escapes in the imminent deadly breach, of being taken by the insolent foe and sold to slavery, of my redemption thence and portent in my traveller's history, wherein of Antris vast and deserts idle, rough quarries, rocks, hills, whose heads touch heaven, it was my hint to speak. Such was my process, and of the cannibals that each others eat, and anthropophagi, and men whose heads grew beneath their shoulders. These things to hear would Desdemona seriously incline, and still the house affairs would draw her hence, which ere she could with haste dispatch, she'd come again, and with a greedy ear devour up my discourse, which I, observing, took once a pliant hour, and found good means to draw from her a prayer of earnest heart, that I would all my pilgrimage dilate, whereof by parcels she had something heard, but not intentively. I did consent, and often did beguile her of her tears, when I did speak of some distressful stroke that my youth suffered. My story being done, she gave me for my pains a world of sighs. She swore in faith 'twas strange, 'twas passing strange, 'twas pitiful, 'twas wondrous pitiful. She wished she had not heard it, yet she wished that heaven had made her such a man. She thanked me and bade me, if I had a friend that loved her, I should but teach him how to tell my story, and that would woo her. Upon this hint I spake. She loved me for the dangers I had passed, and I loved her that she did pity them. This only is the witchcraft I have used. Here comes the lady. Let her witness it. So here again we have the story. Firstly, the fact that her father, Brabantio, loved Othello and often invited him to stay, pass time, eat at their house, and tell the stories of his adventures, of his career, of all the things that had happened to him. And this is interesting, right? Because in the relationship between Brabantio and Othello, we focus mostly on that court scene and Act 1, Scene 2, where Brabantio is yelling and screaming at Othello and saying, "You've stole my daughter from me, you've enchanted her." But here, there is an indication of the previous relationship, which explains kind of why they knew each other at all. And secondly, is a kind of precursor to the own journey that Othello goes on. And as we saw when we looked at a model paragraph a couple of lessons ago, we can describe Brabantio's trajectory from love to out of control hatred as the same, as a smaller version, a microcosm or a precursor or foreshadowing, whatever way you want to say it, of Othello's own trajectory. Brabantio loves his daughter, thinks of her as perfect, seemingly loves Othello as well. And as soon as his control, his reputation is threatened by Desdemona's behaviour, he disowns her and he completely burns all of these bridges. This is the same thing that happens to Othello, but it seems like Shakespeare is setting us up and preparing us for this, hinting at it in the first act, because we can see how then the next 5 acts will go. And then Othello describes talking about all of his adventures. So from his boyish days, from being a boy until literally now, he is telling of all his stories about floods, disasters, battles, being sold to slavery, deserts, all these kinds of different things, of cannibals and anthropophagi, so these kind of mysterious, seemingly supernatural or mystical creatures that he's encountered. Does this do a little bit to align him with something other and establish his position as an outsider, as we've seen in previous lessons? Yes. But also links us to this idea of his adventures, right? And this is where Desdemona comes in. These things to hear, she would seriously. So she liked hearing of these things. The house affairs, so her chores, etc., her role in the house, would draw her away from where presumably all the men are sitting talking. And she would try and get all of her chores done quickly and come back and with a greedy ear devour up my discourse. Interesting there that we have that motif of consumption that we've talked about previously in terms of jealousy. We've talked previously in talking about relationships between men and women. But here we have Desdemona consuming Othello's stories and seemingly wanting more and more. So perhaps in a way a kind of lust, right? A kind of greed, a kind of want Desdemona is exhibiting here. That speaks to perhaps her later transgression, that she is greedy and lustful for Othello. She wants to hear more. She's very different from the passive object of affection she's meant to be. And he notices this. He notices that she likes hearing these stories and takes a bendable hour, free hour, and she begs him, prays to him to tell the whole story because she'd missed parts of it, parcels of which she'd heard, so she'd only heard some of it. He did consent, and she often cried, hearing about his suffering. She gives him a world of sighs, so really she sympathizes with him. She seems to feel for him here. And she thinks it's pitiful here. Interesting as well, because she here is feeling for Othello what seemingly the other characters do not feel for him. They, for the most part, have rejected him, and she here is feeling sorry for him. This is perhaps where their relationship is beginning. She wished she'd not heard it, so wished she hadn't heard about all the horrible things, but she wished heaven had made her such a man. So she wished she could be a man like Othello. Interesting here. Is Desdemona interested in Othello as a person, Or is she attracted to the adventure? Does she wish that this could be her? And attracted, like perhaps Desdemona is for Othello, is for Desdemona is Othello adventure and escape. And she's marrying him because she wants those things. Because she wants to, for example, go to Cyprus, as she jumps for in this same scene. And she also thanks him and bades him, as we've looked at in a previous lesson, bades him, if I had a friend that loved her, I should but teach him how to tell my story, and that should woo her. So again, this means that he is saying, she thanked me for telling her the stories and said, if you have a friend who's trying to get me to fall in love with them, have them tell this story and I'll be in love with them. This is a hint, right? She's saying, I'm in love with you. But she's not trying to say it. She's trying to say it indirectly because she's a lady. Upon this hint I spake. So then he, knowing now how she feels, notice the reticence there, right? Knowing how she feels, he does this. So he's not willing to be kind of the traditional man who just declares his love and asks for her hand. He needs to wait for her confirmation that this is okay. Is this insecurity? Is this gentlemanly? Is this outsider? Is this aware of the transgression? We don't know. It's up to you to argue. She loved me for the dangers I'd passed. I loved her that she did pity him. So we do then have a sense of parallelism in that structure, right? Because we have one character, both of them love each other. There's a mutual feeling there. She loved me for the dangers. I loved her that she felt sorry for me. Perfect relationship? Perhaps not, but it seems like it's equal. And then this is the only witchcraft I've used. So there's no witchcraft I used on her. It's just that we loved each other based on this story. So really, his only witchcraft is being a really good speaker, right? A really interesting person. With how much this play relies on clever speech and kind of linguistic manipulation. Not to say that he manipulated her into falling in love with him, but he kind of persuaded her to, perhaps, through his stories. Again, a precursor to what Iago does in using language to persuade Othello out of love with Desdemona. So we kind of have both sides of this story. And then here comes the lady, let her witness it. So confident enough in this version of the story that says, here she comes, she'll witness that what I said is true. She'll support, in other words, what I said is true. So here we have this beautiful story of their love. We have all of this explanation, and in it Othello shows that he's not rude in speech, right? He is actually very well spoken, very beautifully spoken here. And perhaps then we're like Desdemona. We start to like Othello because he is talking to us about his bravery, etc., and about their love story. So he knows how to be persuasive then. But we also see Desdemona being the active agent here. And we also see, seemingly, that Othello doesn't like her because she's beautiful, the way that Roderigo does, or for her money, or in a lustful way, the way Iago seems to. We have them loving each other for feelings reasons. And enough that he says, let her speak. So this idea maybe of equality there within them. Lever says, there we have the noble and magnanimous Othello, romantic hero and married lover, accepting as evidence against his wife the fact that at the willing sacrifice of everything else, she made with him a marriage of romantic love. So here we have, and this piece of evidence will be useful in multiple different places, right? It will be useful to prove their love, but also the fact that he's willing to disregard their love as well. So there's noble. In this scene, we have this guy, right? Romantic hero, married lover. But we also have the fact that his wife has decided to marry him for love. Not for power, not for reputation, not for duty, but for love. So in the beginning, we are convinced that this is a romantic love. Let's take a look at Desdemona and how she says it when he says, let the lady witness it. She says, that I did love the more to live with him. My downright violence and storm of fortunes made trumpet to the world. My heart subdued even to the very quality of my mind. I saw Othello's visage in my mind, and to his honours and his valiant parts did I my soul and fortunes consecrate. So that, dear lords, if I left behind a moth of peace and he go to the war, the rights for which I love him are bereft me, and I a heavy interim shall support by his dear absence. Let me go with him. Couple of bits here. Firstly, that I did love the more to live with him. So I wanted to live biblically with the more. I wanted to have sex with him, be married to him, all of that. She also says that her love is downright violence and storm of fortunes. Interesting here, right? That we have language of violence and out of control passion in Desdemona's speech in Act 1, because it suggests to us this idea of fate here, right? Though she may not realize it, there's this sense of out of control passion, destructive passion, violent passion that suggests what's going to happen here. That this passion is going to destroy her. The force of her love is going to destroy her. But she says, let me trumpet this to the world. So she is not afraid of what our brothers of state, to incur a general mock, as Brabantio says. She is fine with them declaring this to the world. That's how much she loves him. Think about what that would mean for Desdemona in society at the time. She is, as Levis says, sacrificing everything. Name, reputation, father, family, inheritance, position in society, life, etc. My heart subdued even to the very quality of my lord. Interesting here again, we have this idea of subdued. Her giving into everything he wants, the very quality, anything he wants, she's giving into. The power dynamic that establishes is very one-sided immediately. And the fact that she's saying it then foregrounds for us her passivity or her lack of power in the relationship, her willingness to do what he wants. Even to the very quality of my lord. I saw Othello's visage in my mind. This is interesting because visage is face, right? So I saw his face in his mind. So thinking of her being aware of his race, right? Falling in love perhaps because of his race or despite his race, arguable either way. But definitely that she is aware of the ramifications of her actions here and that she's not falling in love with him for anything idealized, unless we argue the adventure. And again, my soul and fortunes consecrate. So she put her soul and her life, her fate, her fortunes. We can also say her money, definitely, but fortunes in terms of metaphorical as well. Consecrate, that's religious language there. So she is devoting herself to him. Marriage is a sacrament, so that would be part of the marriage sacrament. But also, if she's saying it, that's again suggests this sense of idealization and thinking of their marriage as a holy thing, right? So it's not just her lusting after people, right? She wants everything to be joined between them. How did he gain the power that he had? We would say probably because of his... he was noble born as a Moor, so he's probably noble in his birthplace, but also he rose in ranks in the military. Then, dear lords, if I left behind, so if she's left behind, she'll be a moth of peace, so she'll be miserable. In other words, she'll be deprived of light, she'll be just circling around this light, obsessed, in other words. And the rights for which I love him, so the things that I love for him for and are part of our marriage are bereft me. So I don't get to be with my husband. I don't get to do all the things I promised to do in my marriage vows. And then she says, with imperatives, let me go with him. So she doesn't want to be separate from him. She's insisting on going with him. This both shows she's transgressive and devoted at the same time. So it's a really helpful quotation to think about. Then Desdemona, when she's being questioned by Othello later, says, upon my knee, what doth your speech import? I understand a fury in your words, but not the words. Why? What art thou? Your wife, my lord, your true and loyal wife. 'Tis meet I should be used so very meet. How have I behaved that he might stick the smallest opinion on my least misuse? So this is when Othello is beginning to question her and treat her wrongly. And upon my knee, so she is then begging, what does your speech? She doesn't understand what he's saying. I stand a fury in your words, but not the words. So she doesn't even understand the language he's using about strumpets and boards and infidelity. It's like she couldn't even question it. But also this idea of perhaps naivete, devotion, right? She's so innocent here. And when he says, what art thou? What are you then? Are you the cunning whore of Venice, for example? She says, no, your wife, your loyal and true wife. She doesn't say I'm Desdemona. She doesn't say I'm a Venetian. She says I'm your wife. So reinforces this idea of her role. And then this is later after he storms out. It's I'm deserving of this, that I should be used to, that I should be mistreated so. But again, this questioning, she doesn't know how she's behaved that he could treat her this way. Interestingly as well, Desdemona says, if haply you, my father, do suspect an instrument of this your calling back, lay not your blame on me. If you have lost him, why, I have lost him too. Though he do shake me off to beggarly divorcement, love him dearly, comfort forswear me. Unkindness may do much, and his unkindness may defeat my life, but never taint my love. So this is again reflection after one of these treatments of Othello, which is unkindness to Desdemona. And this is her speaking to him. If you think that my father is the reason you're being called back to Venice, when there is an issue after Cassio hurts Montano, he says, if you think my father is to blame for you getting essentially in trouble with the Venetian government, with the Duke, don't blame me for it, because if you have lost his favour, I've lost him too. So again, we see her completely leaving behind her father, siding with her husband and saying, we're on the same side here, essentially, don't blame me. Standing up for him herself as well a little bit here. But then also saying, if he do shake me off to beggarly divorcement, so if he essentially ruins her by leaving her, remember, only husbands can divorce wives, not the other way around, love him dearly. Comfort forswear me. Comfort be gone from me. Unkindness may do much. It may defeat my life, but never taint my love. So this idea, again, foreshadowing of it will never take away my love, whatever he does to me, even if he ruins me, even if he kills me, or even if this kills me, this suffering. There we have this idea of devotion. And Desdemona also says to Emilia, he hath commanded me to go to bed, foreshadowing the bed he kills her in, and bade me to dismiss you. Okay, so power dynamic. Give me my nightly wearing and adieu. We must not now displease him. So thinking of her role here. Emilia, I've laid those sheets you bade me on the bed. If I do die before thee, prithee shroud me in one of those same sheets. Interesting here. She asks Emilia to put their wedding sheets on the bed. This has been made much of by scholars who say that if these sheets were soiled by Desdemona and Othello when they consummated their marriage, she wouldn't be asking to put them back on, which suggests by the end of the play they haven't consummated their marriage, they haven't had sex. And it's interesting because these sheets would definitely be white, and they're marriage sheets. So these are symbolically her hymen, right? Her physical indication, supposedly, of her virginity. So she is perhaps trying to create this perfect wedding night, but also aligning herself with these innocent sheets of virginity that she then says, if I die, wrap me in them. So bury me in these marriage sheets. That shows my devotion. This is what matters to me, in other words. But foreshadowing again, she does die on these sheets. There is blood on it from Emilia and from Othello as well. So this idea of stained sheets then, the colour imagery, the symbolism, the hymenic imagery or yonic imagery you could say as well, of this idea of her being killed and it being aligned with virginity and staining. Her being killed for her virginity. Desdemona also says, will you come to bed, my lord? And Othello says, have you prayed tonight, Desdemon? Notice the way he refers to her here just before he kills her. But she's asking him to come to bed, so she's inviting him here. It seems like her love is not just idealized, but also real and passionate. She wants to be with her husband on their wedding night. Tenenhouse says that Jacobean tragedies offer up their scenes of excessive punishment. So again, this idea of punishment for women within marriage, that could be a whole line of argument itself, right? Jardine, again, glorious in her resignation. French, she's self-denying. And Hollingdale says Desdemona and Othello are unequal, not in their love, but in their understanding of the naturalness of their marriage. So Othello seems to think that their marriage is unnatural and thus immediately believes that it would be threatened. Desdemona seems to think their relationship is natural and thus is confused as to why they would ever think it would be unnatural or why it would be threatened. Does Othello idealize Desdemona? Let's take a look. Othello says, for example, for no, Iago, but that I love the gentle Desdemona. I would not my unhoused free condition put into circumscription and confined for the sea's worth. This is saying, I love her and would not give up my freedom, his physical freedom, like his life as a free man, for the whole sea's worth. Interestingly, that we had that detail that he had been enslaved before, which suggests that he knows the importance of freedom or knows the value of freedom, and that he would rather choose enslavement than giving her up. He loves her as much as life, in other words. So this detail, this motif of trapping, enslaving, etc., but also worth, this idea of exchange with Desdemona that's transactional, builds this picture of transactionality. Iago also says, faith he tonight hath boarded a land carrack, if it prove lawful prize he's made forever. Here we have Iago talking to the other characters before the court scene, saying, not in front of the court, but outside of the court, essentially, in Act 1, Scene 2. Tonight he has essentially taken over a merchant ship. And if it is a lawful prize, if he's able to get away with it legally, he's made forever. So essentially, similarly to the way he speaks about her with Rodrigo, says that Othello has taken on this great ship, and if he gets away with it, he's made his fortune. He's made. Interestingly, there we have this idea of value with Desdemona, monetary value, and also this idea of taking over her, right? This kind of piracy that is in Iago's language with this legality, right? Othello also says, excellent wretch, perdition catch my soul, but I do love thee. And when I love thee not, chaos is come again. Okay, so here then we have chaos and love as opposites here, the juxtaposition between the two. And this is him saying, God, how much I love thee. You are wonderful. And when I don't love you anymore, we're back to chaos. Interestingly, he uses the word wretch, because wretch can mean terrible, horrible person, but can also mean an orphan or someone vulnerable. So interestingly here that Othello uses this language, is he using it because she is so dependent on him now that she's given up everything else? Is it because he views her as this kind of orphaned and neglected creature, and thus something that he needs to protect, etc.? And essentially it's his love that is overwhelming him in this feeling, but in his language as well there is foreshadowing, there is chaos coming back. If he doesn't love thee, why is he even thinking about this at the beginning of his marriage? And when he starts suspecting her, patience thou young and rose-lipped cherubim, I there look grim as hell. I had been happy if the entire camp, pioneers and all, had tasted her sweet body, then keep a corner in the thing I love for others' uses. Interesting, we've got quite a lot here. This idea of him thinking of her as a cherubim, particularly a young angel, a kind of child angel. Does he view her as human? Arguably no, right? He views her as this kind of supernatural creature, and as soon as that's threatened, look grim as hell. So appearance versus reality here, the juxtaposition between how she looks, and him saying, look the way you are, as in look as this faithless wretch, look grim as hell. So here appearances are really important. But also he says he'd be happy, and we've spoken about this quotation before, happy if the general camp, so if all of his soldiers had had sex with or tasted her body rather than him only having a slice of her and knowing about it. So essentially this is talking about cuckolding, but think about how he's talking about his wife. Is I'd rather everyone have had sex with her and not know about it than only have a little bit to myself and know that I'm being cheated. This speaks of her as something to be consumed, right? Something to be enjoyed, but not as a person here. This is objectifying language, and quite violent language at that as well. Othello also says to her, I took you for that cunning whore of Venice that married with Othello. You, mistress, that have the office opposite to St. Peter and keep the gate of hell. Here he is in this very strange little mini scene describing, Othello is describing Desdemona as a famous sex worker in Venice and Emilia as her pimp. So he's saying that you're the kind of gatekeeper of the devil. Let me into the devil's room, or let me into this sex worker's room. And he's saying, I, you, we have done our course, there's money for your pains. I pray you turn the key and keep our counsel. So here again, he is pretending and speaking as if she's a sex worker. After having finished spoken to Desdemona, he calls out to Emilia saying, yeah, here's the money, we're done in here. Close the lock, and here's the money, and we will keep quiet. Yeah, keep quiet about this. Hello, Nilda's crying over AQA. Welcome. And then Emilia after this, alas, what does this gentleman conceive? How do you, madam? How do you, my good lady? Desdemona says, in faith, half asleep. So she's saying, I'm half fainting at what just happened here. Remember, women before they were married had no knowledge of sex. They had no information about it. This was not something that they would be, it's not polite society that they would be speaking about any of this. So she's shocked to her core, in other words. And for half asleep, this again foreshadows the sleep she's in when Desdemona is sleeping and Othello comes in and murders her, or wakes her up to murder her, really. but also this physical effect of what happens to her, is Othello's treatment of her as this kind of clever, tricky sex worker or prostitute. Just, again, based on this appearance, this idea that she was the Madonna, and as soon as she's not, she's the whore in this Madonna-whore dichotomy analysis. He also describes her in the final scene as monumental alabaster, or essentially made a marble statue. He's calling her. So again, he doesn't see her as human. And then Othello, if she had been true, if heaven would make me such another world of one entire and perfect chrysolite, I would not have sold her for it. So him attempting to justify after the murder, if she had been faithful, there is nothing, not even the most perfect gemstone, I would have traded her for. This then speaks to, again, this idea of her value to him as something that's exchangeable, and saying, well, it's justified because if she was faithful, then I wouldn't have sold her, but I did what I had to do because she'd betrayed me. And he also says, as soon as he finds out she's been innocent the whole time, "O ill-starred wench, pale is thy smock, cold, cold, my girl, even like thy chastity." So again, she returns to my girl rather than cunning whore of Venice, right? Ill-starred means fated. So like Romeo and Juliet, star-crossed, this idea of her, this was destined to happen. Pale, she's gone back to being pale and cold, indicators here of chastity and innocence and purity, but also associated here with death. So he, in a way, loves her again now that she's dead and been returned to her perfection to him. Neil says, the more Othello is made to feel his marriage is a violation of natural boundaries, the more estranged he and Desdemona become. The more estranged they become, the more he desires her. Interesting with this part here, right? The fact that he kind of, in a perverse way, is lustful of her once hearing about this cuckoldry, right? Only murder, it seems, can, with its violent rapture of possession, can break such a spiral. So then this idea of only murder can break this possessive, disastrous spiral that he's in, where he has to control her. He has to have her all to himself. And murder solves that because he has now returned her to this monumental alabaster. He's returned her to pale. Marchitello says it becomes clear that these two different ways of describing women don't actually apply to real women. Instead, they are male fantasies imposed upon women, ideals that men want women to fulfill, and roles women therefore purposely play for their men. So these are male fantasies. Women aren't seen as real women. Men expect women to be these things, and women kind of play the role of these things. So is Desdemona then performative? Is Othello idealizing her in this relationship? For instance, Desdemona often describes her devotion to Othello in front of other people, underscoring that even though she does love him very deeply, she is to a certain extent playing the role of the virtuous wife. Iago then stokes Othello's jealousy in part by forcing Othello to realize there is no way for a man to tell a difference between a truly virtuous wife and one who's just playing the role of a virtuous wife while actually acting as a whore and being unfaithful. So this idea of Iago knowing that women are to a certain extent performative. In his banter with Emilia and Desdemona in Act 2, Scene 1, for example, he says, you guys do all of your work in bed, for example, or you appear faithful, but are you actually? Teasing them a little bit inappropriately, but he knows and they know that appearances matter, right? He is able to manipulate this trusting Othello into saying, and acknowledging that he can't prove that Desdemona is innocent. And it's enough to seem that way. He believes men honest that seem to be so, right? Is what Iago says about Othello. Now let's look at transgressive love. Can it be viewed this way with Desdemona? So can we say, for example, if this is a question about specifically Othello and Desdemona's marriage, we could say, for example, the beginning. This idea of their mutual, clearly deep love. Then perhaps we'd talk about Othello's idealized love. Perhaps then his fallout of love for her, or the destructive consequences of this mistrust within their relationship. We could also look at Desdemona's role as this transgressive character within it. Iago says, "It was a violent commencement in her, and thou shalt see an answerable sequestration." So this is saying it was like a passionate thing that happened to her, falling in love with him. So the falling out of love with him will also be violent. Interesting that he says violent instead of passionate, right? Because that then implies that there was a sense of violence in terms of her own violent tempests of falling in love with him, but also that violence will end their relationship. Foreshadowing. Iago also says, "Mark me with what violence, again, she first loved the Moor, but for bragging and telling her fantastical lies. To love him still for prating, let not thy discreet heart think it. Her eye must be fed. And that the food that to him now is as luscious as locusts, shall be to him shortly as bitter as colocontida. She must change for youth. When she is sated with his body, she will find the errors of her choice. Therefore put money in thy purse." Okay. So Iago here is saying, look with what violence, again, what passion she first loved the Moor, and only for him telling her lies and bragging. So essentially, how foolish is she for falling in love with someone talking nonsense to her? How can she continue loving him just for carrying on and kind of whining at her and mooning over her? There's no way. Her eye must be fed. So she must be, her lustful desires that made her fall too quickly in love and too transgressively in love with Othello, that need of hers must continue to be fed. And you, Rodrigo, who he's speaking to, are going to fill that by being another new interesting thing for her. So essentially saying, this is a whim for her. Be the next whim. She is just going to move on and get bored with him. And interestingly, he says, the food to him that's now as locusts. So this idea that he's saying Othello now desires her so much because she's new to him, right? She's virginal and he wants to consume her. He wants to enjoy her, take her virginity, etc. But soon this sex and love and desire will be as bitter as poison. She'll get older. She'll change for youth. So she'll get ugly, essentially, is what he's saying. And when she is sated with his body, so when she is filled her need for lust, she'll realize, oh my God, what have I done? And then you'll be able to swoop in and take her. Because he's saying there's no way this is anything other than lust. It couldn't possibly be love. So again, we have consumption. We have juxtaposition here between love and lust. We have Iago's depiction of Desdemona and Othello's love in contrast to their own depictions of it. We have as well this idea of lust running out, but also again this misogyny of this thinking like, well, she's just lustful, someone else will fill this, don't worry, she'll get bored. And it seems like Iago is a little bit too into this language of sex with Desdemona. Othello also says, and yet how nature erring from itself. Iago, aye, there's the point, as to be bold with you, not to affect many proposed matches of her own clime, complexion, and degree, whereto we see in all things nature tends. For one may smell in such a will most rank, foul disproportions, thoughts unnatural. So here we have nature again. Nature that was Brabantio's language at the beginning, saying nature erring from itself would run from her guardage to the sooty bosom of such a thing as thou. Essentially saying there's no way that she would have ever run towards you. It's not in her nature to do so. It's not in the nature of anyone of her position. And then we hear Othello saying this. So the language he has taken from the Venetians. Yet nature erring. So essentially, she went against what would be natural for her to do in marrying me. So different from what he said before. I loved her, she loved me. That was the only witchcraft I used. And Iago repeats this. To be bold with you, not to marry so many proposed matches of her own place, skin colour, and position in society, where we say all things nature tends. So that everything in nature would go towards her accepting one of these many matches that she could have had. Why the heck would she have chosen you? And here he says, so if she was willing to choose you over people who would be much better than you for her to have married, there is something rank, something rotten, in other words, and smelly in her will, in her determination to do this. There's something wrong in that, morally corrupt in that, foul disproportions. So she is not balanced. She is imbalanced in some way in her morals, and her thoughts are unnatural. This is much harsher than it sounds to us now, because this is saying she's going against nature, which really is saying that she's going against God. We know what Iago thinks of Othello, that he thinks he's a devil, describes him as such. So this idea that he's steering him towards this idea of she went against everything, these proposed matches, in order to marry you. There must be something wrong with her, essentially, which is what Coleridge also implies in his criticism, which we'll see in a moment. Iago also says, her eye must be fed. What delight will she have to look on the devil? Again, where the blood is made dull with the act of sport, there should be a game to inflame it and give satiety a fresh appetite, loveliness and favour, sympathy in years, manners and beauties, all which the Moor is defective in. Now, for want of these required conveniences, her delicate tenderness will find itself abused, begin to heave the gorge, disrelish and abhor the Moor. Very nature will instruct her in it and compel her to some second choice. Essentially, he's carrying on with Rodrigo saying, she must be fed. How could her interest in looking on someone beautiful, what delight could she have on looking at Othello? He's black. She wouldn't like that, is what Iago is saying. Again, when she is sick of having sex with him, there should be, or flirting with him, etc., of courting him, there needs to be some way to build up that passion and lust again and give it a new appetite again. Consumption, eating there, linked to love and sex. And give it a new appetite. The things that will give it a new appetite: someone who is lovely, good looking, good reputation, roughly same age as her, having similar nice manners and being beautiful. Remember, Desdemona would be a very young teenager, so probably something like 13 or 14, and Othello is meant to be something like 40. So he's saying it'll be much better. She'll get bored and she'll want someone more like her. And he says this is all of these things the Moor does not have, is defective in, so he fails these things. And these things are required. And if they're not fulfilled, then Desdemona herself will be abused. Yeah, Emma, you're saying what? So this idea of, he's saying to Rodrigo, trying to say, you're in, because she'll get bored of Othello. He doesn't have anything that she'll actually want long term. She'll get sickened by him, because those things are needed for a good relationship and he doesn't have any of those. And she'll begin to hate him. and then nature itself will push her to look for someone else. And that will be you, Rodrigo, don't worry. Desdemona was what age? A young teenager, so 13 or 14 probably. Same age as Juliet, obviously unacceptable by today's standards and criminal by today's standards. But this is part of the differences between them that shows that they are so different and that this match is, to many people, unacceptable. So essentially, Iago's saying, like, don't worry, she'll break up her marriage and cheat on you with him regardless, so don't worry about it. So again, pushing into this idea of her being transgressive, her willing to break these bonds, and there's no way she could possibly be a faithful wife because she's disobeyed nature. And Desdemona said, will you come to bed, my lord? Again, this is an invitation to sleep with her. This is not something nice young Jacobean women did. Harris says, Brabantio imagines her sexual transgression as caused by an agency outside herself. So essentially says her transgression was caused by witchcraft, something that wasn't something to do with her character. Yet Iago and Othello worry at another possibility, that her transgression is intrinsic rather than external to her nature. So her transgression of marrying Othello has something to do with her having something wrong with her being defective and immoral in some way. Iago argues that Desdemona's choice of foreign Othello over her countrymen make her a sexual pervert. Now, not pervert the way we know of it, as someone who has inappropriate relationships with minors, but in the idea that there was a wrongness to what she wanted sexually, that she was unnatural in her sexual desires. Coleridge says, be something monstrous, as we said, to conceive of this marriage. It would argue a disproportionateness, a want of balance, as we've seen this quotation before. This idea of Coleridge blaming Desdemona for her own destruction because clearly there was something wrong with her to pursue this. So very much similar to Iago and Othello's own view. Lever said Iago's power is that he represents something that's already in Othello. The essential traitor is within the gate. So this idea that Iago only voices what Othello is already thinking, that Desdemona is actually wrong in some way. She shouldn't want to have him, so it's justified why she would cheat. M11, off you go. Thank you for joining us today and for all your contributions. Now we have other kinds of love. So sororal love, for example. Amelia says, I durst, my lord, to wager that she is honest. Lay down my soul at stake. If you think other, remove your thought, it doth abuse your bosom. If any wretch have put this in your head, let heaven requite it with the serpent's curse. For if she be not honest, chaste, and true, there's no man happy. The purest of their wives is foul as slander. So this is Amelia defending Desdemona to the point of laying down her life here, which shows that she's not willing to believe this slander on Desdemona. Very much in contrast to Othello, who immediately believes it. Desdemona also says, I never saw this before. Sure that some wonder in this handkerchief, I am most unhappy in the loss of it. Amelia says, 'tis not a year or two shows us a man. They are all but stomachs, and we all but food. They eat us hungrily, and when they are full, they belch us. So this is her being realistically trying to comfort Desdemona that it's not just Othello. All men are like this. This is what marriage is like, essentially. Trying to comfort her. And give her the truth, which Desdemona doesn't really know about relationships. Desdemona also says, he's commanded me to go to bed. This is the same quotation that we've looked at previously. But this idea of them being linked and Desdemona sort of confiding what's happening to dismiss you. We know Amelia comes running back later. And this idea that they're in this together, this kind of scheme to get Othello back. Desdemona presumably hoping that he'll see the marriage sheets, he'll remember the love for her, they'll consummate their marriage, and this will all be over. And Desdemona, though, confides in her this kind of preternatural feeling of, if I die, wrap me in these sheets. And we can see them two lying dead together at the end of the play. This really foreshadows that moment. Again, this cunning whore of Venice scene with Othello saying Emilia is this pimp of Desdemona's here, and Emilia being shocked about this and asking about her, right, trying to comfort her, saying, what on earth is he talking about? Are you okay? Essentially. And Desdemona is the one who says, I'm fainting here with panic and worry about this. So Othello thinking she's in on it, aligning them two together in some way, and then thinking of this as Emilia comforting her. And then Emilia, of course, revealing the truth at the end. She says, even when Iago is threatening her to be quiet, I will not charm my tongue, I'm bound to speak. This idea that she has to speak to defend Desdemona, this idea of duty there, as Lucy said, duty and love here. My mistress, again, this idea of possession here and linking close bond in their relationship, and her seeing it for what it is, villainy here. And she said, I'll kill myself for grief. And when she is killed, says, lay me by my mistress's side, and sings to Desdemona as she dies. So this idea of trying to comfort her and their being together, them being united in the marriage bed, rather than Othello and Desdemona as Desdemona had hoped. Bloom says that Emilia is the only one that Iago underestimates, as she's the only one that can ultimately bring Iago down. So this is the power of the sororal bond here, the sisterly bond between them. Bloom also says her heroic victory over Iago is one of Shakespeare's grandest ironies and appropriately constitutes the play's most surprising moment. Yes, the fact that it's Emilia who kind of reveals all here, that it's her and the power of the love that she has for Desdemona that actually saves Desdemona's reputation and brings down Iago. Neely says that Othello's central theme is love, and it is Emilia who most explicitly speaks to this theme, recognizes the central conflict, and inherits from the heroines of comedy the role of potential mediator. She is dramatically and symbolically the play's fulcrum, which means the play's middle point that everything else tips on. Because it's her who speaks truly about marriage relationships. It's her who has a more equal relationship with her husband. It's her who advises Desdemona and helps her. It's her that loves Desdemona seemingly more than any other character, and her that avenges her. Jardine says the stage world of Jacobean drama is wholly masculine, offers there's only a male viewpoint on offer. This is something I've included not necessarily because I agree with it, but perhaps you could use it to contradict this argument, right? If Jardine is saying there's only a male viewpoint on offer, you could say, in this paragraph on sororal love, well, actually, in contrast to Jardine's point, there is this perspective of a sororal bond, because this is the only way we have redemption for the female characters here. It's Emilia that brings this viewpoint that's important. Tennenhouse says that Desdemona is the embodiment of female power at the start of the play. So this idea of women actually having some kind of power here. And Honigman saying that Emilia's love for Desdemona is Iago's undoing. He does not estimate that. As M11 had said, Iago could not believe love as he did not love anyone. The flip side, fraternal love. So love between Iago and Othello in this instance. Iago says, I humbly do beseech you of your pardon for too much loving you. Othello calls him honest Iago and says he's bound to thee forever. So Desdemona says she's bound to Othello. Othello says he's bound to Iago here. And Iago says, I am your own forever. Othello also says, if thou dost love me, show me thy thought. Such a tricky thing, dramatic irony-wise here, right? Because we know Iago does not love Othello, but he thinks he does, and thus all of what Iago says when he says, I think he's honest, and leads him down this path of doubt, is part of the importance of appearance here in the play, the importance of Iago's power. My lord, you know I love thee. And Othello interestingly says, I think thou dost. This is the only place where he seems to be doubtful. And for I know thou art full of love and honesty, and weighst thy words before they give them breath. Therefore the stops of thine fright me the more. So this idea of, I know you love me, and you think about your words before you say, so the fact that you're hesitating now is scaring me more. Again, the power of Othello. Or perhaps the problem with, or the power of Iago, or the problem with Othello is he's too willing to believe it. It's the fact that Iago pauses before he speaks, and Othello's already panicking. This is unlocking something in Othello already, perhaps. Othello also says, I'll know thy thoughts. You cannot if my heart were in your hand, nor shall not while 'tis in my custody. So this idea of honesty and love then, but also this idea that Iago says, well, you can't know what's in my heart unless I give it to you, or unless you take it from me. Othello also says, why did I marry this honest creature? Doubtless, this honest creature being Iago, doubtless sees and knows much more than he unfolds. This fellow's of exceeding honesty and knows all qualities with a learned spirit of human dealings. So again, immediately in an aside, trusting Iago, not doing the same for Desdemona when he doubts her, or is presented information by her. Iago also says, I'm glad of this, for now I should reason to show the love and duty that I bear you with franker spirit. So now I'm glad you've been honest with me. I will now share you more obviously my love for you. I hope you will consider what is spoke comes from my love. So when he's saying about Cassio, please learn this is coming from a place of love. So much here to pull out in terms of the language that Iago uses. It's all relying on love, on Othello's needs to be loved. And Othello also says, now by yon marble heaven, in the due reverence of a sacred vow, I here engage my words. So here Othello is kneeling, Act 3, Scene 3, vowing to get his revenge. And kneels. And Iago, don't rise yet. So don't get up. Witness, you ever-burning lights above, you elements that clip us round about. Witness that here Iago doth give up the execution of his wit, hands, heart to wronged Othello's service. Let him command, and to obey shall be in me remorse, what bloody business ever. I greet thy love, not with vain thanks, but with acceptance bounteous, and will upon the instant put thee to it. So Iago then vows to give everything to Othello's need for justice and to use him however he sees fit. And Othello sees this as love and accepts it. But interesting, he says the execution of his wit's hand, heart to wrong Othello's service. So this idea of this vow being linked with death, the way that when Desdemona and Othello speak, there's also this foreshadowing of death as well and doom. But it sounds like a marriage, right? To obey, to command, the vows, etc. There's like they're all holding hands here and vowing to each other. This is like almost kind of a marriage between the two, but much more sacred to Othello, seemingly, than his to Desdemona. Bradshaw says that Freud maintained that delusional jealousy always includes a homosexual element. Component. So this idea that jealousy that's completely misplaced and crazy always has this kind of jealousy of the person that their wife is cheating with, wanting them as well as part of this. So in other words, Iago wants Othello, and they love each other in a way that has this kind of desire to it. Bradley also says it's been held, for example, that Othello treated Iago abominably in preferring Cassio to him. So this idea then of Iago being mistreated and being jealous of this because Othello chooses or jilts him, in another word. Crawford says if Othello can be capable of such gross violations of all military rules and practices, Iago sees that he can no longer trust Othello and that all confidence between them has virtually ceased to exist, and that no longer can he hope for the intimate relationship of former days to continue. So, in other words, Othello, in choosing Cassio over Iago, has done something terrible to Iago in terms of military rules, but also in terms of their friendship. He's betrayed him, in other words. And so Iago, who once loved Othello, now feels that he can't trust him, which is why he gets his revenge. So their relationship is broken, but it was Othello who betrayed him. A different interpretation, but one you could certainly use. Coleridge says Othello does not kill Desdemona in jealousy, but in a conviction forced upon him by the almost superhuman art of Iago, such as any man must and would have entertained that who had believed Iago's honesty as Othello did. So essentially, Coleridge says that Othello isn't jealous. He is convinced by Iago, and because Othello loves and trusts Iago, he gives into it. And why wouldn't he? Honigman says that Iago is a seductive character, so he essentially seduces Othello with his language, with his love, etc., and pulls him away from his wife. Bradley says his trust where he trusts is absolute. So essentially, he trusts Iago and loves Iago more than he loves Desdemona. Then fated love here. The language of the fact that this marriage is doomed from the start. This is in Act 2, Scene 1. If it were now to die, 'twere now to be most happy. For I fear my soul hath her content so absolute that not another comfort like this succeeds in unknown fate. The heaven forbid, but that our loves and comforts should increase even as our days do grow. So essentially, Othello says, kill me now when I'm the happiest I ever have been, and because I fear that I could never be this happy again. Desdemona says, well, for God's sake, hopefully our marriage and love will grow and we'll be happier and happier as we keep going. But there it sounds fated immediately, right? He's linking this marriage with fate and death and kill me. Othello also says, it is the cause, my soul. Let me not name it to you, you chaste stars, it is the cause. Yet I'll not shed her blood, nor scar that whiter skin of hers than snow and smooth as monumental alabaster. Yet she must die, else she'll betray more men. Put out the light, and then put out the light. So firstly, this idea of he has to do this or it'll get worse. So this idea of she's fated, if he doesn't do it now, it's going to happen in the future because she'll betray more people. But is also the idea of the fact that has to happen. He has to kill her. He's essentially convincing himself he has to kill her, but he won't spill her blood. And this idea of light as well. This idea of stars as this fated love, as he said, this ill-starred wench in Act 5, Scene 5 as well. That also says, sweet soul, take heed of perjury. Thou art on thy deathbed, telling her this. I, but not yet to die, presently. Therefore confess thee freely of thy sin, for to deny each article with oath cannot remove nor choke the strong conception that I do groan withal, thou art to die. So this idea that nothing you say will be able to convince me that you are going to die. You will die no matter what you say. I can't be convinced out of it. Bradshaw says their love is doomed from the start. Also says, makes her the perfect victim for the perfect storm, wherein her husband habitually reins in his feelings and only abandons himself, losing all control when he thinks he has lost the woman he loves. So essentially, Desdemona being naive and not being able to really understand her husband because she's too young and inexperienced means that she's the perfect victim for the fact that when he loses control, she'll essentially provoke him into killing her, or it'll be her responses will be all wrong and she'll definitely die. She won't know how to defend herself or know what he's talking about, so she's doomed. Auden says her determination to marry Othello seems the romantic crush of a silly schoolgirl rather than a mature affection. It is Othello's adventures, so unlike the civilian life she knows, which captivate her rather than Othello as a person. So here could also prove what we've spoken about earlier, this idea that this is her not having a real affection for him either. Her not loving him, but loving the idea of him. So the relationship is doomed because they don't actually know each other, and thus this relationship can't survive. And Gardner says this act is also heroic in its absolute disinterestedness and finality. It must be done. This is the murder. It must be done. It has to be done. There's no stopping it. By Act 5, Scene 2, what's done is done. Neil, interestingly, talking about the violated marriage bed and this focus on the marriage bed as this site of love and marriage here. So says the sensational effect of the scene upon its earliest audiences, this is the final scene, is apparent from the imitations it spawned in the mesmerized gaze of Henry Jackson, who left the first surviving account of Othello in performance. He saw Othello acted by the King's Men, that would be Shakespeare's company when Shakespeare was still alive, at Oxford in 1610, and wrote how the celebrated Desdemona, slain in our presence by her husband, although she pleaded her case very effectively throughout, yet moved us more after she was dead, when lying in her bed, she entreated the pity of the spectators by her very countenance. So this idea then of this murder, the importance and betrayal of this being even more shocking because it's in this deepest and most intimate space, is in their bedroom, in their marital bed, that she's being killed. That is this extra layer of intimacy that's being torn away. He could have killed her in the stairwell, right? He could have killed her in public. He kills her in this intimate, supposedly safe space. And more than any other scene, it was this show of a wife murdered by her husband that gripped Jackson's imagination. But even more disturbing than the killing itself seems to have been the sight of the dead woman lying in her bed. The phrase that echoes Amelia's outrage. My mistress here lies murdered in her bed. For Jackson, the place seems to matter almost as much as the fact of wife murder, just as it did to 19th century Desdemona, Fanny Kemble, when she confessed to feeling horribly at the idea of being murdered in my bed. So this idea of this site of love, marriage, virginity, sex, adultery, betrayal, murder, and innocence, all together brings this idea of this being even more transgressive as a setting for love and marriage. These are a couple of different ways that these questions might come up. How Shakespeare presents love in Othello, or how it presents the theme of marriage in Othello. With love, then, we can talk about idealized love. Idealized love. We can talk about deep, real love. We can talk about fated love. We can talk about sororal bonds and sororal love. We can talk about fraternal love. We can talk about the effects and consequences of betrayal or jealousy within love. And we can look at love and power. We could talk about men's role within a relationship. We can talk about Desdemona specifically. We can talk about Iago or Othello specifically as well. There's so much to talk about. The same for the theme of marriage. We can again talk about it as idealized. We can talk about it as transgressive. We can talk about society's view of this, looking at prejudice, for example, and using these ideas that we've looked at in other lessons, but we can still appropriate into our answers here. We can talk about the fact that this was transgressive, so it's doomed. We could talk about the marriage of them with of Desdemona and Othello with a power dynamic here. We could talk about the violence within marriage. We could talk about Emilia's views on marriage. We could talk about the consequences of marriage. We could talk about women's role within marriage, right? It's specifically. There's so much to do. However, this will all lead to your ideas in your own organization of your own arguments. These are just some ideas to get you started. Let me know what you think. That does bring us to the end. Apologies for bringing us a little bit over our time, but hopefully you found the lesson useful. Our next lesson will be on Friday at 4:30 until 6 on this same channel. As always, the workbook is in the description so that you can see it and use it for yourself. And we have these lessons currently every Wednesday and Friday, with a little bit of a break upcoming for half term in the first week of November. Feel free to give us a follow, My Edspace or Eleanor Does English, in order to be notified for all of my lessons upcoming and all of my content. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.